Let's stop pretending. Everyone in Southeast Asia knows the truth, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Sabah was never a simple territory dispute. It was a promise, a contract, a debt the world conveniently ignored. Until now. And if you've ever wondered why Malaysia gets uncomfortable every time Sabah is mentioned, it's because the historical evidence doesn't just point to the Philippines, it screams it. So today we're asking the question Malaysia hopes you never ask. Why must Sabah be returned to the Philippines? If you're interested in this topic, hit the join button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. Let's start with the truth nobody wants to touch. Not Malaysia, not the UN, not even some officials in our own government. Sabah was never given away, never lost, and never ceded. It was leased. A lease, a contract, an agreement so clear, so well documented, so legally specific that even international law experts admit the Philippines has one of the strongest historical claims to any territory in Southeast Asia. But here's the problem. The world doesn't operate on truth alone. It operates on politics, power, and who benefits from pretending not to hear you. And that's exactly why the Sabah issue became the quiet scandal of ASEAN. Whispered about, avoided, dismissed, but never resolved. Because deep down, everyone knows the Philippines has receipts. Real receipts, documents, treaties, payments, lineage records, international arbitration rulings, evidence so solid that Malaysia's government refuses to debate it publicly. Because doing so means acknowledging a truth they can't afford to say on camera. But before we dive into why Malaysia must return Sabah, let's rewind to the moment this entire story began. Not 1963, not 1946, not even 1898. The truth starts in 1658 with a ruling sultanate and a territory so vast and prosperous that European powers were fighting to control every inch of it. The Sultanate of Sulu, yes, the same Sulu archipelago we know today, once held dominion over a kingdom that stretched from Tawi-Tawi to Palawan to North Borneo. But here's where things get interesting. In 1658, after helping the Sultan of Brunei win a civil war, the Sultan of Sulu was granted dominion over the northeastern portion of Borneo, the land we now call Sabah. Not rented, not borrowed, granted, owned. That alone already establishes a massive historical precedent. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward to 1878. The Sultan of Sulu signed an agreement with two European operatives, Alfred Dent and Baron von Overbeck of the British North Borneo Company. And here lies the entire center of the controversy. The British claim the contract said cede the Filipinos, backed by linguistic experts, say the contract said lease. The term, in the original Tausug document, pajak. And every credible linguist, historian, and Tausug scholar agrees. Pajak does not mean cede. It means rent. Temporary transfer, conditional, revocable, not permanent ownership. And how do we know this wasn't a sale? Because the Sultanate continued receiving annual rental payments. Payments Malaysia continued sending until 2013, which proves they knew it was never theirs. Imagine this, if you bought a car, would you continue paying the original owner every year? Of course not. Only renters do that. Only people who know something isn't theirs keep paying. And Malaysia paid every year quietly, consistently, until the Sultaha heirs filed a case and Malaysia panicked. But here's the twist the world doesn't talk about. The Sultanate never surrendered sovereignty. Not once. Not even under American colonization. The US acknowledged the Sultanate's ownership of Sabah in official documents. The British acknowledged it. Historical records acknowledge it. Even Malaysia indirectly acknowledged it through continued payments. So here's the real question. If Sabah was truly Malaysia's, why were they paying rent? This is where the tension builds. Because Malaysia's claim doesn't come from history, it comes from convenience. In 1963, Malaysia formed its federation. Sabah was included through a referendum that many historians argue was rushed, manipulated, and influenced by colonial powers eager to contain Indonesia during the Konfrontasi era. Was it democratic? That's debatable. Was it clean? No one can say with certainty. Was it enough to erase centuries of documented ownership? Absolutely not. But Malaysia pushed forward anyway, knowing the Philippines was recovering from war, political instability, and lacked international leverage. They used timing, they used geopolitics, they used global silence, and for decades the world moved on. Not because Malaysia was right, but because the Philippines was too busy rebuilding to fight the narrative. But here's where everything changes. Today's Filipinos are different. Educated, connected, globally aware. And the Sabah heirs, they finally brought the issue to international arbitration and won a ruling in Europe confirming Malaysia must pay billions for violating the lease. Malaysia didn't just lose a case, they lost the argument. They lost the narrative. They lost the legal protection they thought they had. Because once an international court acknowledges a lease existed, it indirectly acknowledges something far more powerful. If Sabah was leased, then Sabah was never Malaysia's to begin with. And that's where the stakes explode. Because Sabah isn't small. It's massive, oil-rich, resource-rich, strategically located. Malaysia's economy depends heavily on its oil fields, many of which sit in Sabah. Losing Sabah isn't just losing land, it's losing power, influence, resources, billions. And that's why Malaysia avoids this conversation like wildfire, because they know the moment the world looks closely, the Philippines holds the stronger claim. But the bigger question is this: why does it matter now? Why must Sabah be returned, or at least recognized in 2025 and beyond? Because this isn't just about land, it's about identity, justice, history, dignity, and the global principle that colonial-era contracts should not override indigenous ownership. If the world recognizes this principle for Africa, Asia, and Latin America, why is the Philippines the exception? Why is Filipino history discounted? Why is Filipino sovereignty ignored? Why is Filipino ancestral ownership treated like a footnote? These aren't academic questions. These are real geopolitical questions every Filipino deserves answers to. Malaysia has built decades of silence around Sabah, but silence is not ownership, and history is louder than denial. Before we move on to part 2, where we break down the geopolitical, legal, and economic reasons Malaysia is afraid of revisiting Sabah, I want you to type "Sabah is our ers" in the comments, not as nationalism, not as propaganda, but as a reminder that history doesn't disappear just because powerful countries pretend it isn't there. If part 1 exposed the historical spine of the Sabah question, part 2 exposes the part Malaysia doesn't want the world to analyze: the geopolitical, economic, and legal consequences of acknowledging the truth. Because once you understand why Sabah is so important, you immediately see why Malaysia has fought tooth and nail to bury the conversation, and why the Philippines, for the first time in decades, is in a position where the world is forced to listen. Let's begin with the most uncomfortable fact for Kuala Lumpur. Sabah is Malaysia's economic lifeline. Look at Malaysia's petroleum production map and you'll notice something striking. A huge portion of Malaysian crude oil and natural gas comes from Sabah and nearby offshore fields. Not peninsular Malaysia, not Johor, not Kuala Lumpur, Sabah. According to Petronas' own reports, Sabah contributes up to 30% of Malaysia's oil output and is among the biggest sources of LNG exports. That means if Sabah were ever removed from the Federation, or even reclassified under shared sovereignty, Malaysia's entire national revenue structure collapses. Not shrinks, not takes a hit, collapses. That's why they can't entertain the conversation, because it risks unraveling the economic foundation they're standing on, and that's only the beginning. Now consider the strategic side. Sabah sits right beside the Sulu Sea, Celebi Sea, and the South China Sea, one of the most contested maritime regions on Earth. Whoever controls Sabah controls access to shipping routes, fisheries worth billions, marine energy resources, and a strategic defense buffer zone between the Philippines and the rest of ASEAN. Malaysia knows this, China knows this, the US knows this, and so does every defense analyst studying Southeast Asian security. Sabah isn't just land, it's a geopolitical anchor, and the Philippines having a strong claim to it makes certain nations very uncomfortable, because it shifts regional power dynamics. Malaysia benefits from keeping Sabah, China benefits from Malaysia keeping Sabah, Western powers benefit from avoiding conflict. But the Philippines? The Philippines loses every time the world stays silent. And that silence is why the Sabah issue became one of the most taboo subjects in ASEAN diplomacy. Everyone knows it exists, but everyone is scared to touch it because touching it means exposing a truth that triggers legal, political, and economic earthquakes. Speaking of legal earthquakes, let's talk about the international arbitration case that Malaysia pretends doesn't matter. In 2022, the heirs of the Sultanate of Sulu won a massive ruling from a European arbitrator ordering Malaysia to pay $14,900,000,000 in unpaid compensation. Malaysia rejected the ruling, called it invalid, and refused payment. But here's the twist. The arbitrator didn't invent this ruling out of emotion. It was based on a contractual relationship Malaysia did not deny, meaning by fighting the ruling, Malaysia accidentally confirmed the existence of the lease. And if a lease exists, then ownership still belongs to the lessor, which means Sabah cannot be considered Malaysian sovereign territory in the way they present it. And that is why Malaysia is terrified of the case gaining global traction, because legal recognition of the lease is the first domino in a line of consequences they cannot afford to experience. But the twist goes deeper. Multiple European courts agreed the arbitration had legal weight. Several of Malaysia's assets abroad were temporarily at risk. Malaysia scrambled, even hiring international law firms and appealing to French, Spanish, and Luxembourg courts to stop enforcement. Why? Because they knew the case was credible enough to trigger international asset seizures. No one fights that hard unless they see real danger. And the danger wasn't the $14,900,000,000. The danger was the implication. If a European court acknowledges the lease, what happens when the Philippines elevates the claim to the International Court of Justice with today's political climate? What happens when ASEAN countries are forced to vote? What happens when a UN-level discussion opens its doors? Malaysia knows exactly what happens. History resurfaces, records resurface, treaties resurface. The truth resurfaces. That's why Malaysia has one strategy: delay, deny, downplay. Delay the discussion long enough until people stop caring. Deny any historical claim loudly enough until it becomes common belief. Downplay the arbitration ruling until it fades from public attention. But here's the irony. Malaysia didn't expect the internet destroyed their strategy. Filipinos now know the history. Scholars are teaching the context. Young professionals are reading the treaties. The diaspora is talking about it. And global analysts are suddenly curious because the arbitration ruling woke them up. This brings us to a more uncomfortable reality. Why didn't the Philippines fight harder before? The simple answer: timing. We were too destabilized in the 60s and 70s to wage a diplomatic and legal battle. In the Marcos regime, then EDSA, then insurgency issues, then economic recovery. The Philippines was consumed by crises at home. Malaysia knew this and capitalized on it. But the modern Philippines? The Philippines of today? Globalized, connected, legally armed, supported by a massive and powerful diaspora, capable of influencing international discourse through media, politics, and people power. Malaysia is not facing the Philippines of 1963. They're facing the Philippines of 2025. A nation that knows how to make narratives go viral. A nation that can turn a legal claim into a global conversation. A nation that can't be silenced anymore. That's why Malaysia is nervous. That's why Malaysian officials respond aggressively whenever Sabah is mentioned abroad. That's why their diplomats avoid debates about it, because they know they are one serious court case away from the biggest territorial dispute in Southeast Asia erupting into the international spotlight. But let's be brutally honest here. This isn't just about history or legality. This is about justice. The Sultanate of Sulu's descendants were ignored, sidelined, and ridiculed for decades. Filipino communities in Sabah suffer discrimination and statelessness. Entire families live without citizenship, healthcare, or basic legal protection. And Malaysia pretends it's not happening. But reality has a way of resurfacing, especially when digital media turns buried truths into unstoppable movements. Now pause for a moment and reflect. If Malaysia's claim was truly solid, why are they the ones panicking every time courts get involved? Why do they spend more energy silencing the topic instead of proving their case? Why do they refuse open international arbitration? Why do experts say the Philippines still holds one of the strongest unresolved territorial claims in Asia? The answer is simple and uncomfortable: because the evidence favors the Philippines. And Malaysia knows it. Before we move to part 3, where I expose the political, humanitarian, and diplomatic consequences coming Malaysia's way, I need you to comment, "Continue the truth," so we push this topic into the algorithm where it belongs. Part 2 revealed why Malaysia is terrified of this conversation. Then part 3 reveals something even more explosive: the consequences the world will face when this issue finally erupts into the global stage. Because whether Malaysia likes it or not, the Sabah question is coming back, louder and stronger than ever. And now, unlike in the past, the Philippines is no longer the weak player in the room. Let's start with the most human truth. For the millions of Filipinos connected to Sabah by blood, culture, and ancestral history, this isn't just just a legal dispute. It's personal. It's generations of families separated by borders that shouldn't exist. It's thousands of Filipino children in Sabah growing up without legal identity. Stateless, unprotected, unseen, because Malaysia refuses to acknowledge what they call illegals, even though many of them were born on land their ancestors once ruled. Talk to those families, and you'll hear stories that sting deeper than any diplomatic argument. A mother who can't take her child to school because she has no recognized papers. A fisherman arrested for crossing waters his great-grandfather once owned. A family afraid to report abuse because Malaysian authorities might deport them on the spot. When Malaysia says Sabah is settled, they ignore the fact that actual human beings are living the consequences of that lie every single day. But here's the twist. The world has changed. Statelessness, historical dispossession, and cultural displacement are no longer issues nations can sweep under the rug. International courts, humanitarian organizations, and global media now treat these topics as violations of human rights, not internal matters. And this is exactly where Malaysia's problem becomes global. If the Philippines decides to elevate the Sabah case to the international arena today, it will only be framed as a territorial dispute. It will be framed as a human rights crisis, an indigenous sovereignty issue, a colonial era injustice that still affects modern populations, a violation of historical treaties, a case of ethnic and cultural suppression. These are the kinds of cases the world responds to. These are the stories the international press amplifies. These are the issues that force countries to pick a side. And Malaysia absolutely does not want the world picking sides because they know exactly how the evidence leans. Now let's talk about the bigger geopolitical earthquake waiting beneath this issue. If the Philippines pushes Sabah into the global spotlight, three major powers will be forced to respond: the United States, China, and the United Kingdom. The US cannot afford instability in Southeast Asia, especially with China aggressively expanding influence in the West Philippine Sea. A Philippines asserting its historical rights sends a message that resonates with American strategic interests. A stronger, more assertive Philippines equals a stronger US ally. China, on the other hand, would love a fractured ASEAN because division creates opportunities. If Malaysia falls out with the Philippines, China gains leverage over both. And what about the UK? Historically, the British North Borneo Company played a direct role in the transfer of Sabah. If international courts force a review of colonial-era treaties, the UK's involvement will resurface, and Britain does not want another diplomatic scandal involving colonial assets. Meaning, if this case blows up, three global superpowers could be dragged into a conflict none of them want. That's why Sabah remains the quiet volcano of Southeast Asia, silent but ready to erupt. And yet, the greatest shift isn't geopolitical and cultural. For the first time in modern history, ordinary Filipinos worldwide are questioning the silence around Sabah. Overseas workers, scholars, content creators, young professionals, they are all becoming part of a digital movement that Malaysia cannot silence, the Philippine government cannot ignore, and the world cannot unsee. And this is where the modern Philippines becomes dangerous, not militarily, but narratively. Because narratives shape public opinion shapes diplomacy, diplomacy shapes international rulings, and international rulings reshape borders. Malaysia thought they could erase the Sabah issue through political pressure and silence, but they didn't realize they were living in the age of viral truth. A single documentary, a viral video, a trending hashtag, a leaked document, a scholar's analysis going global, these things can move nations. The Philippines now has a megaphone Malaysia cannot confiscate. And the Sabah truth, it only needs one spark to ignite global attention. But let's pause and acknowledge something brutally honest. Even if the Philippines has the stronger historical claim, that doesn't automatically mean the world will side with us. Global politics doesn't reward truth, it rewards leverage. That's why the Philippines need to strengthen three fronts: diplomatic courage, global advocacy, and legal strategy. Without these, historical truth becomes historical trivia. But with them, the Philippines becomes unstoppable. Diplomatically, the Philippines must do what Malaysia fears most: push for arbitration, request ICJ jurisdiction, and bring the case into the spotlight of ASEAN and the United Nations. In global advocacy, Filipinos abroad must continue what they're already doing: telling the story, publishing the research, demanding recognition for stateless Filipino families in Zabala, and forcing the world to confront the human cost of ignoring history. Legally, the Philippines must compile and modernize all historical treaties, leases, maps, and agreements, especially the ones Malaysia refuses to discuss, and combine them with modern human rights documentation. If the Philippines builds these three pillars, Malaysia won't just be uncomfortable, they'll be cornered. Because sooner or later, the world will ask the question Malaysia has spent 60 years avoiding. If Sabah fully belongs to Malaysia, why does the evidence say otherwise? And here's the final twist, the part nobody talks about. If the Philippines wins even partial recognition of its historical rights to Sabah, the impact would be massive. Billions in potential resource claims, an expanded maritime zone, influence over shipping routes, stronger strategic positioning in the South China Sea, recognition of ancestral sovereignty, justice for displaced Filipino families, and perhaps the most powerful outcome, a unified Filipino identity. Because nothing unites a nation like reclaiming something the world said was impossible. Now, before you continue watching the next chapter we're working on, I need you to comment, Filipinos deserve the truth, so this video spreads to more Filipinos at home and around the world.